Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and welcome to the Bad Lab Live. Today, we're going to be talking to Dr. Faisal Sultan. Dr. Sultan, of course, is the Special Assistant to the Prime Minister of Pakistan for National Health Services. He's essentially the federal government's minister for health. And as the Minister for Health, he essentially governs and guides Pakistan's national response to COVID-19. It's quite a complicated structure, public health in and of itself being a provincial subject, the federal government having some purview and jurisdiction, but certainly not the service delivery part of it. And of course, Pakistan was seen as a big success story as far as COVID-19 and the initial fight back against the first wave was concerned. As the number of cases and the fatalities begin to increase again and start to approach, in fact, exceed some of the highs from June and July, there's a real worry that the second wave of COVID-19 in Pakistan may not be managed as well as the first one was. This is a perfectly legitimate concern, and we thought nobody better than Dr. Faisal Sultan to address it. Dr. Sultan was the head of the Shaukat Khana Memorial Hospital for nearly 2 decades prior to this role. His career has essentially been invested in infectious diseases. It's a great privilege and pleasure to have you, Dr. Saab, and thank you for making time to walk us through the various issues involved. Every time you speak, of course, I just want you to make sure you unmute yourself so we can hear you loud and clear. But welcome to the Bad Lab Live, and thanks for taking time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Saab, the second wave, what I'm saying to people is we're about 3 to 4 weeks into the second wave already. And what I'm not able to discern myself, and one of the reasons I really thought it was important to talk to you, was to figure out how long this wave might last, how much bigger it is, and whether or not the nightmare scenarios that many of us were fearful of but never transpired in the first wave, whether any of those look like they might come true.
So yes, what you're asking is we dodged a bullet the last time, and whether we will do it again. And what's the danger now? The quantum of the danger, the timing, duration. All great questions. Unfortunately, nobody in the world will be able to answer these to any level of satisfaction. But let me take a crack at it. Let me put out some thoughts. First of all, there is no evidence that it's going to be any lesser in terms of magnitude or severity compared to the first wave. Simply because what we are seeing so far is a similar or a proportionate number of people in the health system, at least who are sicker and sick enough to be on oxygen, compared to the numbers that get tested positive, a week or two prior. And so the similar kind of ratios continue to be maintained. I think that's so. So in other words, it's not going to be any less severe than the previous wave, as best as we can tell at this juncture, as you said, 2 to 3 weeks into the second wave. About its duration, again, impossible to tell, obviously, just like we could not tell when the peak was going to arrive. We could only tell once it had gone past, and you could look back and say, okay, now we are climbing down from the peak. Similarly, here, it'll be impossible to really know how big and how high and how long the peak is going to last. But there are 2 things that are of note and that we need to keep in mind. First, that the second wave is always different because of the fact that a certain number of people have already had infection. And so therefore, logically speaking, there are fewer people left to infect. However, that is significantly counterbalanced by 2 factors. One, the change in weather. Whether that has a direct effect or not is one thing, but what it does indirectly is change your network density, your social network density. One, simply because when it's colder, people huddle together, etc. But in our particular case in Pakistan, winter is the season of weddings, and people having a lot of social events, even beyond weddings, because the weather is nicer, because you don't need air conditioning anymore. You can do a lot of socializing with friends and family, etc. So it's the season when more festive things tend to take place. And weddings in particular hold a particular or special risk in my view. One, it's a festive occasion, everybody meets. So it's not you go to a restaurant or you sit somewhere, you do your business, you eat and you come back. Um, at a wedding, the fundamental purpose is to go meet a set of people. And so every single guest will go meet at least the core people that are the hosts, the groom, the bride, their close family. So it's almost a perfect arrangement for spreading something because everyone is going to go meet that one person or those set of a handful of people. So it's this sort of thing that has contributed to the present wave. And therefore, while we have come out of the first wave quite well, relatively speaking, but these are additional factors that should give us due concern on how we will fare through this. That is exactly why our focus has been, in terms of advice and national policy, the focus has been on trying to say, well, look, we need to mitigate this risk by modifying our behavior during weddings. And thus this idea of outdoor weddings, which certainly reduces the risk, and reduced number of guests and so forth. So I think that will have an impact in slowing and mitigating things. So I think I apologize, I've given you a long-winded answer, but the short answer is that the duration and height of the next peak, the second peak, is unknown, but it is likely to be not less than or similar to it, likely to be similar to the first one. The last bit is that because it is winter, and if indeed temperature has any impact or effect on this, whether directly or indirectly, then because winter in the northern half of the country, in any case, will last till the end of January, so we've got about 2 months of risk and challenge ahead.
So I think, first of all, please don't apologize for a long answer. I think that's exactly the format here. We want long answers because I think this is really complicated stuff, and it's very difficult to minimize or reduce these complex issues into quick sound bites. Of course, we try our best, but I think some things merit in-depth discussion. Sure. So much of what you said sort of resonates, but also raises other questions. You'll remember, and we talked about this, we had the chance to talk about it with you directly as well, on school reopenings. The big concern wasn't that schools, the question really isn't, should people get married or not? Of course they should. Should kids go to school or not? Of course they should. There's a learning loss in one case, and there's societal loss in the other if we stopped weddings for, let's say, 2 months. The real question is activities that create the opportunity for super spreading, and especially events or processes that allow for or lead into mass transmission. So anything where the ecosystem is naturally geared up for transmission is something that, obviously, as you described, needs to be avoided. A lot of people have this concern. I would say I do too, although my concerns are, articulated differently than they were in the first round, given the miraculous kind of performance that Pakistan had in the first round, which we still, I don't think, can explain entirely, although I think some credit is due to the government and to the PM's approach. But by the same token, if we praise the PM and the government for how it managed in the first round, one concern a lot of people have, Dr. Saab, is that the degree of seriousness when it comes to behavioral change communications, to public communications at large, the idea of modified public behavior, even something as simple as masking. I know this is something that you kind of discuss within the NCC and the NCOC regularly. Could you just explain what that conversation is like? Obviously, without giving away any state secrets, but what is the hesitation on the part of the government to be more aggressive, not in terms of fining people, because I don't think that the society and the state are structured in that way, but in terms of convincing people, even to wear like a dupatta or a bandana or anything, like just covering faces, for example, would mitigate the risk by so much. And yet we haven't seen masking taking over in terms of social behavior.
So you're absolutely right. I think this is now solidly in the realm of psychosociology, or social, or sociology and psychology, somewhere where they overlap. We are solidly in that area. The issue is that as far as the messaging the first time around was concerned, it somehow had greater, and I'll explain, I think understandably had greater traction. The receptivity was higher because it was the great unknown. We really had not gone through any experience of this nature ever in anybody's memory. And therefore, people were more likely to listen and be afraid or have some apprehension on what the disease would do, and therefore the adoption of masking was somewhat better. I have to tell you, I don't think we were at any stage as good at masking as many other countries, but relative to our own system and how our society works, we did adopt it. At the present time, what's happened is that I think because we came out of it relatively, I wouldn't say unscathed, I mean, thousands of lives is not unscathed, but compared to other countries, we came out of it much better. And therefore, a certain sense of invincibility, I think, has crept in. And it's changing now. In the last few weeks, it has changed with all the focus in the media. Our conversations are almost going hoarse talking about it. Has had some impact, but you're absolutely right, nowhere near what it did the last time. Now, the first time around, we did have a conversation with all the leadership, with the Prime Minister himself, and he was very receptive to it and started using the mask quite regularly and in public, and made a demonstration of it and talked about it. And to be perfectly honest, he has continued to voice this. He's continued to say the same thing. And in fact, one of the things that he has repeatedly said, both in private as well as at the NCC, is that one great technique, one great tool we have to allow continuity of business is the use of masks. I think he's got it, and he says it, but I think the receptivity of that message has been blunted. We do need some innovation, some thinking on how we can get around this and how to resensitize the entire population on this very, very important issue. I think one single intervention will do a lot of wonders. But while we wait for that impact to happen, we've been forced to do some more, I would say, some more blunt intervention, although not as blunt as a general purpose or a blunt lockdown, but more blunt interventions like asking the wedding industry to sort of move outdoors from inside the buildings and so on. No choice, because time is of essence and things are moving fast, and so therefore we had to do something. So while we get people to the idea of masking again, some interim measures are and were required and have been put in place, and some more might be in the offing. We're trying to see what to do with educational institutions. We've had extensive back and forth with the educational establishment, as well as with the whole range from provinces to the federal level, from small children all the way to universities. We are having a conversation on this again with a lot of data from school testing and educational testing on the 23rd. And we hope that we can come with something that has impact and yet is not terribly damaging.
Yeah, I think this balance is going to be, no one is ever going to be perfectly happy. And least of all, perhaps you, given that you yourself are an expert. I think, we'll always be dissatisfied with how much we've achieved. As you said, even one dead person is one too many. Talk to me a little bit, Dr. Saab, about the nature of the. I know that you've already addressed it, but I'm going to press a little more on this question. The virus, in the first instance, there was a lot of distinction between urban and rural infection rates, between urban and rural fatality numbers. Male and female gender seemed to be an issue. I think in Pakistan, I think it was the Wall Street Journal that identified the fact that female mobility is lower than male mobility in terms of economic activity and general mobility at large. So perhaps that was helping inform the numbers. When you look at the numbers today around male versus female, urban versus rural, rich versus poor, and young versus old, And that one particularly, because that relates to the schools issue. What are you seeing? Are you seeing things that are different from the first wave, or are you seeing a repeat of the patterns that we saw in wave one?
Not terribly different. To be perfectly honest, the male preponderance continues in the same sort of ratio. About a third, approximately, are women as far as the disease distribution is concerned. And I think the fundamentals of the disease, as best as we can tell, are not significantly different. Those that are getting unwell, the proportion that are going on to oxygen and who require oxygen and more aggressive therapy remains similar. There are some changes, and I think those have to do more with how the health system has learned how to deal with the epidemic. I'll highlight two. One is that those people that are admitted in the system but are not on oxygen. So, in other words, the number of admitted patients not on oxygen, proportionately speaking, is much lesser, much smaller this time around. Primarily because in the first wave, a lot of people, both the health system and perhaps individuals themselves, patients themselves, ended up expecting that they would be admitted and that some treatment would be given necessarily. And I think with time, everybody realized that there was absolutely no reason to hold a person in the hospital uh, on which an active treatment, for example, oxygen, is not required. So that's one thing that has changed, but it's not a change in the disease. It's fundamentally a change or learning on how to tackle with it a little bit better. I do also see somewhat higher utilization or better utilization of high flow oxygen. And I think, again, our health system learned that that is probably one thing that holds the key to try to preempt, intubation and full ventilation. So that again is, I think, a change in practice rather than any change in disease. The virus itself, every single virus and every single bacteria that exists, all life, in fact, changes with every reproductive cycle. This is how evolution happens. This is how viruses and bacteria change and mutate. But one little fact that's gotten lost in this story because of, I think, some media focus and some conversations by individuals on this topic is that just because a mutation has occurred in the genetic makeup of a virus does not mean that that specific mutation portends or translates into a more or less harmful outcome. Some mutations are neutral, they don't have an impact on the actual behavior of the organism. Some actually give it greater virulence and some give it lesser virulence. So at this time, I am unaware of any mutation that we can solidly put our finger on and say, well, this is what's caused a greater virulence or greater spread. There is one mutation that somebody's described in the last some weeks, which actually provided the reverse, that there was some evidence that there was milder forms, but again, they form a small proportion of the total number of viruses. So bottom line, again, I think that mutations are a fact of life, simple. But we are unaware of any known mutation that has translated into a more vicious or violent or more virulent behavior, I should say, by the virus.
No, that's really helpful. That was going to be one of my questions. Thanks for addressing it. Okay, so we've talked about sort of the fact that it's slightly different, but not hugely different. Obviously, the system itself has learned how to deal with some aspects of it better than the others. Are you concerned at all about report of hospital wards, COVID-19 hospital wards? In some cases, I've seen pretty solid reports of Peshawar and Lahore, and in fact Karachi as well, where hospital wards are full. Do those numbers? I mean, these are anecdotal. So, given that you have the full picture and the dashboard every day at the NCC, are you as concerned, or are we okay? There's no reason to panic on that front. And at what point should we start panicking?
Okay. I'm a worrier by nature, so I always look at these things, and some of these should worry because, if you don't plan, then of course you run the risk of being in trouble later on. But I think that in some situations, we've seen some numbers that were higher. So Islamabad, for example, in terms of the number of occupancy of ventilators, but somewhat higher a few days ago. It's a little bit lower today. I had similar concerns about the numbers in Multan. But in all other cities, the percent occupancy of ventilators has been in very comfortable range. Now, that is not to say that on a given day or at a given hour for a particular patient, they may or may not have had difficulty in finding a suitable bed, because in all these cities, there are 2 or 3 or 4 hospitals that are the go-to hospitals for getting care for, especially for this kind of thing. And understandably, they fill up first. So sometimes what happens is that there are beds available, but people end up going to the more popular or the more sought after place, and may not find a bed, and then they have to go to another place which they may feel is not ideal for them or is more difficult. Logistics, their house may be different, far away from that hospital. So it is this kind of unevenness of availability that causes anxiety. But at this time, we are nowhere near the situation that we had reached in June, and we are in much better shape. And I think our ability to have a surge increase, a surge capacity in the system is also better. But until the epidemic, the curve starts to slide down again, somebody like me will remain concerned and with a very watchful eye on what's going on.
I think, it's really interesting you say, because obviously we do know that in terms of vent capacity and oxygen capacity, there was a huge investment. Initially, it was the NDMA, and then obviously the private sector doubled down. The State Bank of Pakistan created a special facility that was able to finance private hospitals. And we know there was drawdown on those facilities. And there was a lot of work, I guess, between May and August that probably has put us, in terms of physical capacity, in a better place. Let's shift a little bit, Dr. Saab, because your job, you're not the chief fighter of COVID-19 for Pakistan. You're the chief public health guy for Pakistan. And I think that, that raises the question of, I think, twofold. One is, how much of the fight against COVID-19 consumes your attention and in a sense distracts you from some of the other foundational issues in our public health system. There's issues like public health coordination between the provinces and across provinces and with the federal government. There's, polio is an issue, and I know you've pushed pretty hard on improving Pakistan's standing on that front, which is super vital. Just because we bought a bunch of vents and have more oxygen obviously doesn't mean that we can administer those vents and that oxygen appropriately, because human resource training is a big question. Maybe start with the human resource capacity and then build outwards in terms of your agenda for reform. I mean, you've come in after 25, 30 years of imagining what could be better about the system. Now you have the opportunity. It's a blessing, but it's also a curse. You have COVID-19 pulling you in the direction. So talk to us a little bit about system-wide capacity.
Okay, so that's great. Talking of strategy in the midst of operative heat. So first of all, the ongoing surge, the second wave, certainly does detract and takes time, because it's urgent and important and it can't be put away. So sometimes it is natural to postpone or pen things that are of a more strategic nature to the back burner, and then focus more on the urgent and immediate problem. Understandable, but as you correctly point out, that also in some ways, and if it's done for too long, it actually is counterproductive, because unless you address the fundamental problems of health, of public health, of how you deliver health, this is not going to get sorted. So you mentioned polio and you mentioned HR, and so let me just talk a little bit about what the reform agenda is all about. Let's take the infectious diseases programs first. You mentioned polio. Now, polio is a source of embarrassment and concern for Pakistan. We are only one of two countries left where wild polio virus continues to exist. And it will require continued concerted efforts of the existing kind, but also some very serious rethink on how to do things somewhat differently. Because whatever has gotten us to this point may not take us to the point of elimination of the virus without actually some change in track. We have peculiar and particular problems. They're not, necessarily unique, but they are Pakistan's problems. We have certain hotspots. We have certain high-risk union councils, and we have certain populations that move between two or three places in a very set pattern, and we tend to not be able to reach them as effectively. So, in other words, a more nuanced and directed approach to tackling polio is required. More of the same will alone not solve the problem. It also requires greater strengthening of the normal vaccination system, the EPI or the PEI, and so that without sorting that out, polio alone, in itself, will not get eliminated completely. In other areas, we are trying to readdress and change how we are going to tackle things like tuberculosis, malaria, HIV. Malaria program relatively has done better in recent times, but for tuberculosis and HIV, we retain concern. We think that our numbers are not getting better the way they should be. And in HIV, we've had worsening in some of our high-risk groups in terms of prevalence of the disease. So here, two or three important things are required. First of all, we get donor money, which is fine. Somebody wishes to help us, and we should always welcome that. And then we should use it judiciously and properly. But at the same time, we as Pakistanis need to put in our own investment. So, for example, if you have a strategy to tackle tuberculosis, for example, or hepatitis C, if the entire strategy, say, costs 100 rupees, and we fund only 20 rupees out of that, and another 20, for example, comes from the donor segment, you're still left with 60% uncovered strategy. So if you have defined strategy that's supposed to eliminate tuberculosis and you're not financing it, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Tuberculosis will continue, and it kills more people than we imagine. It's in the shocking range, and yet we don't seem to register it. So all these vertical programs, one, require greater resource allocation to it. Two, smarter, more capable direction for these programs. And third, and very important, it needs to be woven in to the fabric of our primary healthcare system. This exceptionalism and verticality, whether it's for population, for these vertical programs, for polio, for nutrition, none of these are going to have the full impact unless it is part and parcel of your health system. To me, that's the challenge. If we are able to make it mainstreamed into our healthcare delivery, the impact of all of these will go up exponentially. So that was infectious disease programs. As you know, I'm a clinical infectious diseases doctor, and it bothers me especially that some of our challenges in IDs and infectious diseases remain as they are and have, in fact, worsened and not gotten better. Switching gears, manpower. Let me just start with the thing that we have the most dire crisis in is nursing. We are one of the most nurse-short countries in the world. We have we need 1 million nurses over the next few years, and we have only 1/10 of that. And if we go at the current rate of production of new nurses, especially a proper 4-year degree program in nursing, we are going to take decades to reach that number. So clearly, that's not an option that we want to take. So one of the things that the government has done, one of the things that we have done and came from the National Health Task Force, was to allocate money to upgrade and enhance the capability of existing nursing schools by investing in their skills labs and other facilities, plus, very importantly, into faculty. If you're going to train bachelor-trained nurses, you need master-trained faculty, and we don't have enough to do the kind of scale-up that we want to. So that injection of nursing faculty requires money, and we've put together a PC1, inshallah. We're going to have that approved and fund that, and that will all happen. All the action will happen in the provinces, but the federal government, I think, wishes to inject that extra cash into the system to power that up. Now, it's not just numbers. let's talk about quality. We felt, so the PMDC or PMC, we've had extensive discussions about it. It's impossible to go into too much detail in it, but the existing regulator required an upgrade and enhancement to ensure that, for example, the oversight and regulation of medical colleges and medical graduates comes into the 21st century. It is done in such a fashion that there is no regulator capture by the regulated entities, and it takes into account the fact that the way knowledge is transferred, how people are trained, what they're trained in is relevant to the 21st century medicine requirements. So thus this PMC bill, an act, it got passed through a long and tedious process, but I'm very happy that it's working well, and inshallah you will see the effects of this within the next year or so, the impact of this. Similar reform needs to come into regulators for nursing, as well as we need a new Allied Health Act. It's in the process, it's going through the works. And so the federal government's role in improving both the numbers and the quality of the health manpower is crucial. Because of time, I'm not going into every single one of these, but it all holds true for pharmacy, for even for non-traditional methods of healing, etc. While we are on reform, a crucial element of provision of good healthcare is the pharmacy part of it, the medicines, pharmaceuticals, the biologics, as well as the equipment, the modern tools of medical delivery, as well as things like stents and implants and things, literally tens of thousands of things that are used in medicine today for better medical care. So the Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan has done a job until now in the context of what was required. Fundamentally, it was the regulator for drugs, but after the whole crisis on stents, it expanded its remit to include devices. And so we think that serious built-up of capability and resource and method of how work is done is required in the Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan. And we intend to enhance it and to really scale it up and make it a great regulator for not just great quality, but also to make sure that there is access to a lot of these technologies. So, for example, if our only way of getting stents for the heart, for example, is importing, then we are used to the idea that a third party has a stamp of approval on it, and we accept that as a stringent regulator. We say, well, okay, fine, if they've approved it, we accept it. But what if we are making our own? And so we had to even retool ourselves into now saying, fine, if there's a product within Pakistan that is not necessarily approved by the FDA or by a European regulator, are we able to say, well, this meets certain quality standards? So the regulator now has to come to terms with the idea that Pakistan itself will now be the producer of many such technologies and abilities. So regulation is one important stream which addresses both the manpower as well as some of the products that are deployed in healthcare. One other crucial bit that is highlighted by COVID, but ought to have been highlighted long before, is the need for a Center for Disease Control. We have a National Institute of Health that has a laboratory that serves as a reference and important lab for the country. But I think we need to have a CDC Pakistan. So the legislation for that is ready, and it's going to be, inshallah, passed through the normal system, which will allow for creation of a CDC Pakistan, so that the next time there is an epidemic, you don't have to run around and form an NCOC in a hurry and actually have a structure that is built in and uses the existing pillars of the government, like the NDMA, etc. In a predefined fashion. You just turn the switch on, and here you have the beginnings of a future epidemic response center. This is not easy because it requires inflow of data from the provinces, analysis at the center, consultation at the center, then sending back that information, administrative action, follow-up, logistics. It's complicated stuff, but I think this is the time to have now transpose what we learned at the NCOC and NCC and take it to a permanent structure.
On the question of CDC, sorry to interrupt. I mean, sure. I've tried not to, because I think it's really important for people to hear all of these different ideas about reform that you have on the CDC. And this relates to a number of other, questions around reform, and you address some of them vis-a-vis the vertical programs and the need to house reforms at the provincial level. CDC is a great example of how you might need concurrent provincial legislation in order for the federal legislation to have the kind of effect that I think you envision a functional CDC having. And particularly on the research and development side, I suspect that what your vision is not just for the CDC to be a disease response sort of an instrument or device, but also a disease anticipation and down the road, and we'll come to this more fully in a second, but also vaccine development and that sort of an area. So how is that going? How are the conversations and the relationships, without getting into the wider political atmosphere, which is pretty toxic and which many people blame the prime minister for, equally many people who are his supporters blame the opposition for. But really, in terms of specifically public health and the issues you're talking about, how is the dynamic between you and the various provincial ministers and governments?
It's great. It's not toxic at all. It's immensely cooperative. And I mentioned the nutrition. I mentioned the nursing program. There's a similar nutrition program that I was going to tell you about. Similarly, a population and a program to help in our benchmarks and our targets. And in every single one of them, we have had great conversations with all the health ministers, Dr. Azra, Mr. Taimur Jagda, Dr. Yasmin Rashid, and Dr. Baledi in Balochistan, and with our counterparts in AJK and GB as well. So to be honest, despite whatever toxicity exists outside in the domain of conversation, jalsas and so on, that's there. But the fact is that in terms of the professional cooperation, I've not, there's nothing that I would say is anywhere near what you would describe as toxic. I would say it's all very cooperative. We've had, of course, different points of view. We have discussed them, accommodated them in a very warm and very professional way with all of them. And in fact, interestingly, it's not just that you can have a different point of view of dealing with a disease or a situation which requires provincial cooperation necessarily smoothly with a province that might have a government by the PTI. Individuals have their ideas, they come with experience and background and knowledge, and sometimes they see a problem somewhat differently. So I think I've had great engagement with all of these people, and I see no difficulty at all in going forth with a national CDC or a national vaccine center.
It's really great to hear the quantum of cooperation and I think professional sort of warmth that you've described, and I think anybody, Pakistani or non-Pakistani, would be delighted to hear it. Obviously, there may still be political issues, but it's good to hear that the provinces and the federal government, have this kind of interaction. Dr. Saab, talk to us a little bit now about the vaccine question, because that's one that I think concerns a lot of folks. There are people that are, in a mad rush to be part of the testing groups. As soon as we heard the news from Pfizer, and every day the news gets better. I think it was 92.5, then 95. Today I heard it was 99. So alhamdulillah, that sounds like good news. The Moderna sort of vaccine, also very good news. And CanSino seems to be addressing some degree of optimism out there. How many of these is Pakistan in the market for, is in conversations for? And again, without obviously, divulging anything that necessarily might be sensitive, but it'd be really interesting to learn as to which of the vaccines Pakistan is likely to get and what the quantum is that you're looking at and the timeline.
Thank you. It's a bit tough to answer without specifics, but as you hinted yourself, some of the specifics may not be ideal to mention. But what I can tell you is that we are in active conversation, with all the top 5 or 6 manufacturers and producers of potential vaccines. The challenge here, of course, is to see which one fits us best in terms of our ability to gain access to it, to pay for it, to have great efficacy and low set of side effects, and our ability to actually use it given how our immunization program is structured. I am referring, of course, to the fact that some of these vaccines, currently in discussion, very effective, at least by initial reports, require a very strong cold chain of a very extensive, cold. In other words, minus 80 or minus 70 degree freezers are not easy to deploy in developing countries at a mass level. Pakistan does have hundreds of minus 80 degree freezers, but they're already deployed either in industry or for research. So not easy to just sort of empty them out and say, well, let's use it for this. You can even procure and produce additional freezers, but you have to take into account how how much of the population, how much of the initial target population can you actually reach with this kind of vaccine versus another kind. So all this conversation is going on, not easy. I tell you, it is difficult because the set of variables is just too many. And so it requires brave decision making. We have asked the government to set aside some money, and in principle, that's been agreed. But that approvals process is going through, and I think, inshallah, in the next few days, we should have a clear idea of what exactly we put aside for this. The real challenge, I think, would be to, we live in an environment, this is important, we live in an environment where professional decision making sometimes becomes difficult because people are risk averse. People are afraid of well thought out decisions being challenged at various places later on. And so we need to make sure that whatever we are deciding is the right thing, but it has to be done in a timely fashion. We can't wait forever because that's a huge risk as well. So right time without wasting money and yet risking the least amount of uncertainty that comes with betting on a new product. Not easy, but I think, inshallah, with a lot of collaboration and help, it will happen.
I mean, this goes to the larger point. Obviously, you've very artfully and I think delicately made the point that I'm not under the same constraints as you are, that I can maybe talk about more openly, which is the obviously the bureaucracy's fear of being victimized, either because of political reasons or because of genuine reasons, and in an environment, and again, sorry to use the word of very high polarization. Maybe toxicity is too strong, especially given that you're a medical professional, but definitely high polarization. It makes decision making much riskier, especially for those people who are known as principal accounting officers, drawing and disbursement officers, and so-called competent authorities. And so I hear that, and yet, of course, that wouldn't be any sort of excuse for Pakistan if Pakistan was to fall behind. Some people fear that because India is such a much larger market, because China is so dominant in so many spheres, that countries like China, India, the US, and European nations, that somehow Pakistan will fall behind in access to a vaccine, will fall behind in terms of the best quality vaccine. How would you address those concerns, Dr. Faisal Sultan?
So these disadvantages of size or of prior investment into the right industries and manpower, for example, I mean, Serum Institute of India makes such a large proportion of the world's vaccines. The technological muscle of places like the US or China, for example. So we've got to be punching always above our weight and size, and inshallah we will, by capable and agile thinking and smart placement of our interest and how we actually access the best options out here. It's not easy when you are a smaller player in a very competitive situation right now. There are countries with much more money. They can place billion-dollar bets on all of the half a dozen top vaccine candidates and literally elbow everyone out. But there are other initiatives going on, like the COVAX initiative and other well-meaning individuals, companies, organizations who think that to have some semblance of a level playing field to ensure that at least high risk groups in all countries, low, middle income, low income, everybody gets a chance at basic protection. So I think in our case, allocating a reasonable amount of money and then having a prioritized list of who we are going to vaccinate first should get us through.
Uh, Good. I mean, that's good to hear. Final sort of, again, going back to the second wave, uh, if the wave lasts beyond January, and suppose it overtakes the current predictions or the anticipated levels of fatalities, hospitalizations, ventilators. Uh, to what extent would that complicate the procurement of the vaccine? I mean, are the two related in any way, or is it that the vaccine is a separate stream altogether? I ask this because of, for example, financial allocations. The more that the second wave or potentially a third wave impacts Pakistan, the less fiscal space it would have to address kind of preemption through a vaccine. How do you help the NCC and the Prime Minister and the provinces at large think through this issue or this challenge of equilibrium or this delicate balance?
If it gets to this point, I hope it doesn't, but if it gets to this point, it will be important to remember one little fact, which is that the inability to invest into such an intervention at that time, if that intervention has known and proven to be effective. So the inability to invest into an effective intervention of that kind, even if it was above your ability to truly pay for, you would end up paying much more. So I think sometimes in a crisis, you have to invest into something that is above and beyond what you could normally afford, but you have to make sure that you remain viable and that you can have a great comeback, both of your economic system and your health system later on. It's a philosophic really answer. I haven't worked out any numbers, and neither am I an expert on financing. But I think that this would be the approach. I do feel, however, that if we turn the right levers, we will be able to impact the trajectory of this present epidemic.
Excellent. Doc, final sort of question really is around the kind of use of technology and the manner in which it has enabled this. I mean, I know, for example, and many people are aware of the fact that the NEOC infrastructure from the polio tracing regime was really helpful. But I also know that the NCC itself has invested an enormous amount of effort through the appropriate government bodies, including the NITB and many others, to really expand the digital footprint of what the state knows about what's happening. To me, at first blush, that's really exciting. I have lots of friends who are concerned about human rights and privacy, where that's a concern. Let's set aside those concerns for the moment. In terms of the capacity of somebody like yourself to know what's going on and to address it, what role has digital and data at large played, and to what extent is the current scenario, the post-COVID scenario, or the post-March to about now scenario, empowered you and the state of Pakistan, the government, the various provincial governments, to do a better job on the second wave than we might have in the first?
Oh, you cannot overemphasize the role of this information that helped in decision making the first time around, and the first.
No, I don't want anyone to miss. I don't want anyone to mishear what you said. You said this information, this data,
information, this data. Yeah. So the information flow that came through, and its automation and its improvement with time, and improvement of its quality and real time availability, really has helped in fighting and managing the COVID epidemic. Had this not been there, I don't think we would have had the kind of success that we did earlier. Everybody keeps talking about, the mystery of why it happened, and I'm always, I think one should always be humble about it. I'm always happy to say, well, there are unknowns that we don't know, and the famous unknown unknowns. But at the same time, there were known factors, and one of those knowns were the effective use of data, both for contact tracing as well as just detection and reporting of cases. That has helped us so far. I think it will help us in the future as well. And beyond COVID, the CDC that we were talking about, and you just put your finger on it, which is exactly the issue. You can make anything at the center if it's not being fed data, and it doesn't have the outward reach, the outbound arm of this whole 360 degrees. You're not going to get anywhere. And so data is central and crucial to this. And even I'll briefly touch on the concern that you mentioned. I'm a libertarian at heart. I mean, I believe in the right to everybody having their own privacy. But I think if it's done right, and if it's properly ring fenced, and data is only used for what it's supposed to be used, I think for the collective good of our country, this is great. And I do think that there is enough maturity in the system to realize that this data ought not to be used for anything else other than the ability to help in stemming the epidemic.
I think from that perspective, in a sense, the technology and telecom sector in particular then becomes a really crucial potential game changer, does it not? Because you essentially, I mean, I hadn't thought of this before, but the way you spoke about how impactful the data and information flows were means that, for example, if we had faster internet, if we could deploy 5G tomorrow in Pakistan, how would that help, public health? Well, it sounds like quite substantially. Do you see yourself and public health practitioners as being sort of central stakeholders in that conversation?
It's inevitable. I mean, I can predict to you that there is just no way that we will have high impact healthcare delivery without utilizing some bit of technology, and most of it related to data connectivity, reach. And obviously, as medical professionals, we see there's a whole other technology that we're always consumed with, the MRIs and the radiation machines and the lab machines and high tech, surgical robots and whatnot. And of course, that is what makes medicine. But I think what we've also become very sensitive to, and I've understood, especially after the COVID epidemic, is the centrality of good and great data connectivity between systems, and from systems to decision makers, and actually right even in the clinical domain. In my previous role at Shaukat Khan, I had the privilege, really it was accidental, but of with our team helping to build our information system. So I was only too aware and too sensitized to what great work can be done, and impactful work and high quality work if you actually deployed excellent data infrastructure. So I think that if you expand that at a country level, the gains are even bigger.
Dr. Faisal Sultan, you've taken out an enormous chunk of what I know is extremely valuable time. Every morning, quite early, your day starts with the preparation of the entire spectrum, but I know the NCC consumes a big chunk of your time, and obviously any questions on public health you end up fielding directly from the Prime Minister, from the various provinces. So for you to take this time to talk to us, really, really grateful for that. I hope that folks who had a chance to listen to Dr. Faisal Sultan are assured in some ways. But I think the most reassuring aspect of this is to learn that Dr. Faisal Sultan, you are a worrier by nature. So I think the fact that you're worried, is reassuring in the sense that we know that you'll keep burning the midnight oil and trying to find ways to address the current challenge, which is this second wave, and which is quite scary. If you had to leave us, and I give the last word to you, Dr. Faisal Sultan, if you had to leave us with one sort of key message in English and in Urdu, because we may actually use this, just to kind of remind people that as the chief, the fighter in chief, you have this message. What would that message be?
Mask. I think while we wait for vaccines and while we wait for other great technological and systemic advances and whatnot, let's use this. Let's put this on. This holds the key at the present time. This is the poor man's vaccine. Even at this time, it's even the rich man's vaccine. And I really think that if I could pass one message through you, is to our friends and colleagues, everybody, every Pakistani, in fact, everybody in the whole world. We're all in a very similar challenge, and I think if we are able to use masks effectively, especially in crowded places, especially in closed environments, I think we'd break the back of this epidemic.
Absolutely, well received, and of course, not only publicly but privately as well. One will try to incorporate that in our day-to-day routine. Thank you so much, Dr. Faisal Sultan, for making time. Hope the viewers benefited from this interaction. We'll see you again very soon. Assalamu alaikum.